Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Full Scottish here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Brian Liddy. I'm joined today by two guests. We have Richard Thomson, who is the SNP MP for Gordon, and Richard, you're the also SNP spokesperson for Business and Trade since 2022. Welcome, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And our second guest is Simon Barrow. Simon, you're the director of the Politics, Ethics and Belief think tank Ekklesia, and you're also the editor and author of 5 books on Scottish politics, most recently A Better Nation, The Challenges of Scottish Independence. So thank you for also giving up some of your very valuable weekend.
Good to be with you again from, unfortunately, not too sunny Leith.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. So we'll start off with our, again, sadly routine update of the situation in the Ukraine. It's day 641 today. So Russia has sent waves of kamikaze drones into Ukraine in what Kyiv claims is the most intensive drone attack since the start of the war. 5 people were wounded by falling debris, including an 11-year-old child. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, said several buildings, including a kindergarten, were damaged and about 17,000 people in the Kyiv region were left without electricity. Ukraine's Air Force said it shot down 74 of the 75 drones that had been launched in the attack. Ukraine needs more air defences to protect its grain export routes as well as regions bordering Russia, President Volodymyr Zelensky said as he addressed an international summit on food security in Kyiv. He said, "There's a deficit of air defence, that is no secret." Zelensky told the gain from the summit... Zelensky told that the grain from the Ukraine summit, which was attended by senior officials from European countries, including Swiss President Alain Berset and Lithuanian Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė, Zelensky said Ukraine would be supplied by its foreign partners with vessels to accompany convoys of cargo ships from Ukraine's port to guarantee their security. While in Kyiv, the Swiss President Alain Berset paid homage to the victims of the Holodomor famine that he said was provoked by Soviet leaders. Berset also met with President Zelensky to discuss humanitarian demining, the use of frozen profits from the assets of the aggressor country, and the peace formula. The Latvian President, Edgars Rinkēvičs, was also in Ukraine and met with the country's Prime Minister, Denis Šimel, to discuss the progress of Ukraine's integration into the EU. The UK Ministry of Defence has reported that Russia's Black Sea Fleet is facing issues reloading its vessels with cruise missiles. A Ukrainian soldier who was posthumously awarded a medal after a widely shared video showed him declaring glory to Ukraine before being shot dead has been commemorated with a statue in his hometown. The video, shared in March, showed a Ukrainian soldier, later named as Alexander Machivsky, who was a sniper with a unit from the region of Chernihiv, saying "Slava Ukraini," a phrase symbolising Ukrainian resistance to Russia's aggression. Standing unarmed, smoking a cigarette in a wooded area, Matsivsky is then seen slumping to the ground, apparently struck repeatedly by unseen shooters. Kyiv blamed brutal and brazen Russians for his death. Former Russian Prime Minister turned Kremlin critic Mikhail Kasyanov has been added to a list of foreign agents, Russia's Justice Ministry has announced. Kasyanov, who served as Prime Minister for the first 4 years of Putin's administration, now appears in the Justice Ministry's Register of Foreign Agents, a term reminiscent of the Soviet-era enemy of the people. He was sacked in February 2004, and he went into opposition to the Kremlin then in 2022, Kasyanov left the country and has criticised Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's the first update. Richard, as an MP, I'll come to you. I'll ask you first. Was there anything in today's update that caught your eye?
No, I think particularly the resumption of drone attacks on Kiev. I think there's been a merciful tailing off on that, but clearly I think sanctions are having a certain impact on Russia, but there's clearly they're able to step that up again, whether that's drones coming from allies in Iran, or whether they're able to repurpose goods that are falling outside of the current scope of the sanctions. So I think there's a piece of work to be done there, not just in terms of helping the Ukrainians to continue to improve their air defences, but also in terms of the analysis of the drones that have crashed to see what is going into them in terms of civilian electronics, etc., which is being repurposed, and to see if there's any way to further tighten that net to restrict the ability of the Russians to launch attacks of that kind against the Ukrainian population. But I think that the thing I would take out of this is that really the two sides seem to be at a bit of a standstill at the moment, and the biggest problem the Ukrainians seem to be facing is a lack of ammunition. And really, if you want to change the dial on the conflict in Ukraine, then it's about making sure that the Ukrainians have the ammunition for the rocket systems have been given and for their conventional artillery, because really that is where the Russians, if they have any kind of advantage at all, right now they're lobbing, shells that are 50, 60, 70 years old at the Ukrainians at the moment. If there's any advantage to be gained, it's in making sure the Ukrainians have the modern munitions they need in sufficient quantities to make the impact that they want to have.
Thank you, Richard. Simon, is there anything that you could maybe want to add?
Well, I think we should just note that in spite of the tragedy in Israel-Palestine, which we're going to come on to talk about in a few minutes, we still have war at the heart of Europe. And this is something very serious for Europe and for the international system. And as Richard rightly says, at the moment, both sides are fighting each other to something of a standstill. Obviously, it's Russian aggression, which is the key issue that we need to address in this. But also, there is, in the long run, going to be no military solution. There's going to have to be some solution that involves the international community in seeking to impose peace with a degree of justice in this situation. And this is something that we're facing on a worldwide scale. So it's a microcosm. But the fact that it's happening at the heart of Europe, in the midst of a settlement which was supposed to end conflict after the Second World War, is extremely concerning, and something that we shouldn't criticize in spite of all the other tragedies going on in the world at the moment.
Thank you, Simon. First item on our running order today is the situation in Gaza. So there's today is the third day of the 4-day ceasefire in Gaza. There's been another hostage exchange that's taken place overnight, with 17 Israelis and 39 Palestinians released. And in the West Bank, 215 Palestinians, including 55 children, have been killed by Israeli forces, with an additional 8, including one child, have been killed by Israeli settlers since October the 7th. Richard, Stephen Flynn was criticised for not bringing in Grangemouth into his questions at PMQs earlier in the week. But he called for instead that not a pause in killing the children, but a permanent ceasefire. And he also called on Sunak to recognise Palestine as a country, or recognise the state of Palestine. I'm guessing you were in the chamber at the time. And what was it like?
Well, I think once again, Stephen Flynn asked the questions that Keir Starmer should have been asking. And it was notable that out of there are two people who are vying to be the Prime Minister, and there's one of them who's never going to be Prime Minister, who looks far more Prime Ministerial than either of them, and is developing a sure-footedness and a gravitas that is utterly denied either to Starmer or to Sunak. I hadn't picked up that he was criticised for not mentioning Grangemouth. I have to say there's a particular strain of thought amongst a particularly virulent and online strain of unionists that seems to think that if you're Scottish and in the SNP, then you've got no business talking about international relations or reserved matters, even if you're elected to the Parliament that deals with reserved matters. And I don't think we should waste much time discussing the absolute unhingedness of that proposition. But no, it was the Chamber in general terms, I don't think really knows how to deal with somebody like Stephen, who's sharp and direct and to the point and doesn't mince his words. And, once again, he has struck the tone exactly right and has said, asked the questions and put the challenge to Sunak that I think most decent people, wherever they are in the UK, are expected to be put about the crisis in Gaza. And yet again, and not for the first time, he's putting the Labour Party leader to shame, and not just his willingness to ask the questions, but also to be direct about it, not beat about the bush, not mince his words, and to stand up for what I think are the values of most people in relation to this conflict.
That's interesting, Richard, because you might like to know that the person that criticised Stephen Flynn for not bringing up Grangemouth was Alex Salmond, as in the National today. So,
well, can I just come back on that? I mean, I think I used to work for Alec, and I've become increasingly disappointed with some of the attitudes. It seems to be that if the SNP says black, Alec will say white if it gets on my headline, and of course, for the moment, it does. There are. The Scottish Government will rightly be leading on a response to the distressing news at Grangemouth. There's a whole range of issues there, from the future of the employees to our energy security going forward. But I think to criticise Stephen for going on Gaza on this, I think it shows a lack of judgment in that, and I think he's in his desire to get some headlines. I think he's missed the mark there.
Thank you, Richard. And Simon, there was a letter from the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, to Rishi Sunak, calling on the UK to recognise the state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, as over 130 members of the United Nations, including 9 members of the European Union, have done. Do you think if that was to happen, that would it help us get to the two-state solution and peace?
Well, I think it's obviously something that should happen, but I think we need to step back from the immediacy of that to look at the situation we're in at the moment. And what we're facing in Israel-Palestine is a catastrophe which is both human and political. I want to start with the human because often, we're numbed by the statistics. I mean, 1,730,000 people displaced in Gaza, the vast proportion of the population. 20,000 people killed, at least 18,500 of them known to be civilians, and something like 8,000 children. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. In addition to the 1,500 people slaughtered by Hamas in Israel. I mean, this is a tragedy of immense human proportions. And as the now retired Melkite Catholic Archbishop Elias Shakur once said, the real tragedy of the situation is that both Palestinians and Jews are deeply wounded people. But at the moment, the political situation is that they can't look on each other's wounds and identify themselves in each other's suffering, but rather see each other as a threat and an enemy. And the political situation is being driven by extremists. We have an extremist right-wing government in the Netanyahu government in Israel, and we have Hamas as supposedly representing the Palestinian people. In fact, they don't. They represent a proportion of the Palestinian people who've come to power, partly because Netanyahu's strategy was to bring them to power, to try and undermine Fatah, to undermine the Oslo peace process, and to undermine the possibility of a two-state solution. And the undermining of that two-state solution has happened in a number of ways. It's happened through the settlements. It's happened through breaking up Palestinian territory virtually into Bantustans. And if you look at the water table also, there are enormous economic and social problems with creating that state. So the first thing that has to happen is that we have to have a permanent ceasefire. And again, the international actors have to come together to force both sides to the table and to begin to look towards that kind of solution, whether it's a two-state solution or a one-state solution. People are going to be unhappy. And the difficulty is that we also have to bring some of those extreme voices to the table. It's no good simply writing them off. They are part of the picture. So we are a very, very long way from a solution. But in the first instance, the priority has to be to recognize the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians, to recognize the desire of the Israelis for security, and to recognize that that's not going to happen through slaughter. And this isn't a war between Israel and Hamas. It's a mass slaughter going on at the moment, and it's the solution to absolutely nothing. And that has to stop in order to be able to move forward with the diplomatic and political moves, which, again, in the long run, are going to be the only way forward. But it's extremely difficult to see out of the dark at the moment.
Thank you, Simon. You mentioned bringing in other voices there, and so what about Qatar? Is there a chance that they could be helped to negotiate a longer ceasefire? Richard, I don't know if you've got any. Sorry, Simon.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, I think, Qatar can play a key role. I mean, the Arab states more widely need to be brought into the process, of course, because they are part of the wider conflict of which this is a segment. Also, I mean, I think shifting policy and attitudes in the United States is going to be extremely important. And you talked about voices and mentioned Qatar, but there are other voices that are not being attended to at the moment, I think are exceptionally important. And that is the voices of Jewish people expressing solidarity with the Palestinians, seeking peace with justice for all people in Israel, Palestine, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. Newspapers like Haaretz, which is being threatened with being closed down in Israel at the moment, B'Tselem and other Israeli human rights organizations. We need to hear these voices because, as well as the war that's taking place, there's a propaganda war going on, which is seeking to divide people and make that lasting settlement of peace with justice more and more difficult. So we need to bring all parties around the table and listen to the voices that are being ignored.
Thank you, Simon. Richard, we've still got a couple of minutes. Is there anything that you've got to say?
Not really, except to reiterate things that I've said on various appearances I've made over the course of the last few weeks. And, when I spoke to the rally for Gaza in Aberdeen a few weeks ago, that ultimately the only solution to this is political, it's not military. And the Qatar government seems to have been playing a role behind the scenes in terms of brokering the pause in hostilities. It's allowed for the hostages to be returned, as we've been calling for from the very outset. But I think the things we need to remember is this conflict did not begin on the 7th of October. There is no military solution to it. If there was, it would have been settled decisively a long time ago. The only solution is a political solution. I would say I still hold out hope for a two-state solution, which allows Israelis and Palestinians to live in the same part of the world in peace, prosperity, and dignity. That's the only way that we can move forward on this. But I think that the catastrophic human toll of children, women and men who've been killed, over 15,000, now over 5,000 children, it's utterly horrific. But yet the leadership of Hamas still seems to be in place. So I think, just looking at that statistic, I think you can see that this is a military operation that, despite what the Israeli government says, it's going absolutely nowhere. The leadership of Hamas is still substantially intact, and the body count just grows and grows and grows. So this gives lie to any sense that there's any kind of targeted or precision element to what the Israelis are doing. They're not having any effect in terms of eliminating Hamas, as they would like to say, and ultimately it is going to be a political solution, and it needs to recognise the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership, in not just in Gaza but in the West Bank, and a way has to be found that can allow that lasting settlement to be found, and which allows the extremists on both sides to be marginalised, because the extremism that we've seen, as embodied by Benjamin Netanyahu in the administrations he's led latterly in Israel, he billed himself as being Mr. Security. Clearly, that was utterly false. He failed to defend the Israeli citizens on the 7th of October by preventing the attack. There was a failure of intelligence. There was a failure to secure the border there. The Israelis paid a terrible price, and there's no amount. There's an even more terrible price being paid currently in Gaza for the blind fury with which he's lashed out. He has long been part of the problem, and I hope that people in Israel are now able to see that clearly, and that not just the Palestinians can end up with better leadership, but also the Israelis can end up with better leadership as well.
Thank you, Simon. And it's true, the fatalities, when I see the figures, I can't help thinking that maybe it's a typo or something. And of course, it turns out that they're accurate. But I'll move on to our next item, which is about the normalisation of the far right. Recently, there's been, Simon, you mentioned earlier that in Israel we've got a far right government. In Italy we have Giorgia Meloni as Prime Minister, and there in Argentina, we've got what a fellow who's known as El Loco, Javier Milei. He's the new far-right president there. And then recently in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, his far-right party, got 37 seats in last week's election. One newspaper described it as an election earthquake, sends a clear signal that voters are fed up and losing their patience. But I'm just wondering why is, I mean, we've had Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, of course. I'm just wondering how is it allowed to happen that far right are getting such a stronghold in their politics? Simon, I don't know if that's something that you'd want to tackle first.
Well, yes, and of course one could add to that Hungary as well, and Trump leading in the polls in the US in spite of all the criminal and civil cases going against him. So undoubtedly, the far right has been on the rise for some time now, and that's getting ever more serious. We saw, thankfully, the defeat of Bolsonaro in Brazil, but the situation in Argentina and Netherlands shows us that the threat of the far right has not gone away at all. In fact, it's deepening within the fabric of European politics, and I think is also aligned to, unfortunately, the failure and recession of social democratic politics. I know that Richard has written about that himself, so he'll probably have some comment to make about that. But you use the word normalisation. It's extremely important that we do not normalise the far right. Anti-immigration policies, anti-human rights policies, and so on are being pursued by our own government at Westminster. Which has characteristics that previously we would have identified with the far right. And these kinds of policies are extremely dangerous. But the reason that the far right gains traction is that the broader neoliberal settlement within the global order and within Europe has not been working for many ordinary people. We've seen policies of austerity which have punished ordinary people for the massive failures within the financial system, the disconnect between the financial system and people's ordinary needs, the fall in living standards, the fall in wages. Wages across the UK will not recover to 2008 levels until 2028. And so one of the things that the far right politicians are able to do, and the far right civil groups as well, is to try and find scapegoats, to blame migrants, to blame refugees, to blame disabled people at the moment. Again, we're seeing policies at Westminster which are continuing to target and almost criminalise disabled people. This kind of politics, unfortunately, does have a resonance with some people who are looking out of frustration for someone to blame. But the answer is not to accommodate to them, not to accommodate to those kinds of policies, but to address the underlying issues, people's need for economic security, for housing, for education, for social services, for basic human dignity. And when the overall system fails to deliver that, then that's when the far right are able to capitalize on it and use populist rhetoric, anti-immigration rhetoric, anti-human rights rhetoric in order to further their interests. So really we need to turn this situation around by addressing the underlying issues and causes of these dangerous populist movements.
Thank you, Simon. And so, Richard, you have been in the chamber when you've been able to watch Keir Starmer and the UK Labour in operation here. Do you think, is it, Simon implied, is it that the opposition isn't strong enough? It really just comes in weakly behind and says, well, we won't do that, but we'll do the same, but just a bit weaker?
Yeah, pretty much. Look, I think Simon gave an absolutely superb answer there, and I'm not sure I can really add to it much. But it's very, very comprehensive. But yeah, I think that's the danger of the kind of triangulatory approach that Labour still takes to politics. That what you need to do to face down the normalisation of the values of the far right is to have very strong values of your own and to be able to explain them clearly and coherently and to win people's consent for them. And the reason that people are struggling, or they feel they're struggling to get housing, or that they feel the NHS is under pressure, it's not because of immigrants. I mean, if it wasn't for immigration, the NHS would be on its knees. The reason you can get seen at A&E departments across large parts of England particularly, or get GP appointments, is because the doctors that you're getting to see, or the medical practitioners, have come here from other countries in order to make better lives and to help improve the lives of people who are already here. So we need to have an honest discussion about immigration and the benefits that come from that. But for too long, the Conservatives have been determined to weaponise it as an issue because they think it rivals up their base. And the Labour Party, scared of its own shadow, rather than saying the reason that there's a shortage of housing is because we haven't built enough, and the reason they haven't built enough is because of years of austerity, which this lot introduced at Westminster, they, as you put it, Brian, just say, well, we'll of course we need to address this, but we'll do it in somehow a better way. And really, I think they've been shying because the Labour Party is so hollowed out. For too long, it hasn't been able to have that kind of conversation with the people that it expected to vote for it, that contributes to a sense of a political class, particularly south of the border, that's out of touch. But really, the fundamental core issues are the ones that are being ignored in terms of what kind of state do you want and what do you want that state to do. And the people who are getting blamed for the shortcomings of years of governments failing to invest in public services and to redistribute wealth and opportunity are those who have the least voice themselves in this debate. And it's far, far too easy to punch down. And it's almost like a divide and conquer, that if you can get people who don't have much pointing the finger of blame at those who also don't have very much, instead of the 1% who have the most and who have given us a politics that does not deliver in terms of investing in public service and creating long-term value in the economy, in which has seen greater and greater levels of inequality emerging. If that's the way that you choose to play your politics, then it's hardly surprising that the right wing or the extreme right can begin to get a toehold in terms of some of these debates. And I think the other aspect of this is that the loss of trust generally in traditional media and in politicians. It means that people are able to get messages that do not stand up to scrutiny out there, and people are perhaps more willing and credulous and willing to believe things that a few years ago might not have landed, in terms of the impact of immigration or what governments are supposedly proposing. And, it ends up in a pretty dark place. But fundamentally, it needs politicians who are prepared to be honest with people and to stand up and not cede the impression of being honest to the snake oil salespeople of the far right, because fascism and far rightism, as has been said before, it turns up as your friend. It promises to clean up the neighbourhood. It promises to sort out the elements that you find undesirable, but it doesn't stop there. And in the end, it's everyone's liberties and opportunities that end up being curtailed, but as it slowly the philosophy begins to eat itself. So, if we want to be living in peaceful communities, if we want to be living in prosperous communities, we need to be making sure that we have governments that are creating opportunity, balancing fairness, allowing people to live the lives that they would wish to lead, making sure that opportunity is there, and making sure that there is a fair distribution of resource and opportunity in society, so that everybody has the chance to make the best life that they possibly can. And that, in many ways, given where we are, starts with a fair, an honest discussion about the role that immigration plays, and also about what the state needs to do in order to bring these circumstances about. And that's how you drain the swamp.
Thank you, Richard. And talking about draining the swamp, I mean, we should really move on time-wise, but Simon, I can't resist. I just have to ask you, how do you, when you consider Boris Johnson during and since the pandemic, the UK had one of the highest death rates in the planet, and yet we're constantly told that Boris Johnson got all the big calls right. And when you look at the actual figures, you can see that that's not the case. I mean, and yet they still just keep saying it. And how do you even when you counter it with facts, how do you fix that?
Well, I think that's a really important point, and also to pick up on a couple of things that Richard said there. There's a kind of anti-politics that's being deployed very cynically and calculatedly by the far right. And that anti-politics consists of three things, really. First of all, saying, oh, we're not really politicians, we're, all politicians are the same, but we're something completely different. This is what's happened in Argentina. It's, of course, the big shtick that Trump tries to use as well. And to a certain extent, Boris Johnson has. But I mean, Boris Johnson is being unraveled by the moment by the COVID inquiry, and not just him, but also the government that he led and the institutions of the UK state coming under question as well. Now, that provides opportunity, but it also provides huge danger, because, as I say, that's a vacuum that the far right can move into with this anti-politics rhetoric. And also, social media plays a role in this. I mean, for example, in Ireland, we saw the spread of disinformation, and the agitation from the far right brought some thugs out onto the street. So they're using social media in a very calculated way to do that as well. And also because many people through social media find now that they've got a voice, but feel that it's not being heard and listened to. And so there's that kind of emotional deficit within politics. And you mentioned, Brian, facts. Well, facts, of course, are very important. And Richard set out the facts regarding immigration, overall, the benefits that it bring very clearly there. But the difficulty is that lots of people don't respond to facts. They respond to emotion. They respond to what they see on the doorstep and the context that that's given by the rhetoric with which they are surrounded. So we actually need, as Richard said, to have clear policies that bring prosperity and equality and address people's real needs. But at the same time, we have to have an emotional political argument for not blaming our neighbours, not turning on one another, and recognising that the people who threaten us are not those coming in small boats, but those billionaires turning up in planes who are part of an economy that's asset stripping us on a massive scale and needs to be changed and challenged.
Thank you, Simon. The next item is Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. So earlier this week, Jeremy Hunt announced his autumn spending statement, with proposals for tax cuts to be funded by public service cuts. Some other things that he mentioned was, he said there would be 110 growth measures. He said that the government was making long-term decisions, that they would have not big government, but not a high-spending, high-tax government. They would do the opposite and reward hard work. There was also talk about levelling up, reforming welfare, and cutting business taxes. It was billed as a tax-cutting budget and a reward for the tough economic decisions that the Tories had taken earlier. But I'm wondering, have they really cut our taxes? Again, Richard, I'm tempted to come to you first, because you're often in the room when these events are actually happening. Is this a tax-cutting autumn statement, or is it the opposite?
No, it's not a tax-cutting autumn statement at all. If you look at the back of the budget statement booklet that gets released as soon as the Chancellor sits down, there's about £20 billion of measures in there. Some of that represents a tax cut through the the 2%, the 2 pence cut in national insurance, but most of the rest of it is revenues foregone through measures like full expensing for businesses that the Chancellor brought in. So yes, there's an element of giveaway there, but he also didn't move the tax thresholds in terms of income tax, so more people are getting through fiscal drag, as it's sometimes termed. They're coming into higher bands of taxes as their earnings increase beyond the thresholds that haven't moved. But the fundamental fact is that we've got the highest level of tax, despite what the Tories say, as a share of the overall economy since Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister. But sadly, we have none of the ambition of the Attlee government in terms of building a social settlement that is fit for is fit for their needs. And there's a number of reasons why money is bleeding out of the system. There's the continued drag that Labour PFI, which the Tories continued, has on the public service, bleeding money out into the hands of a private sector that is, in that sense, is not productive. But yeah, I mean, the tax burden is very high. But this was a budget or a statement that really needed to be about putting money into people's pockets. The SNP argued that everybody should have a £400 rebate on their energy bills. Now, we'll see how important that call was, because literally the day after the autumn statement, Ofgem announced that the energy cap was going to increase by 5%. So everybody's bills, if you're not already locked in on a lower tariff, which I think must be just about everyone at this point in time, your energy bills are going to go up again. And that if you're in work, that national insurance cut is going to get taken by the energy companies in effect. But if you're not in work, then you're not going to benefit from that national insurance cut. Fair enough, your benefits are going up at the higher rate of October at 6.7%, but it's still going to be very, very tough. And if you were struggling to pay your bills before the autumn statement, you're still going to be struggling to pay them afterwards. So I think while it's understandable the Tories would want to talk about tax cuts, I think he's held a bit back. I think he'll be letting rip in the spring with something else, possibly leading up to an election in May. I don't think that's a done deal quite yet. I think they'll be looking at the polls very carefully, but what they've certainly been trying to do in terms of their framing and their narratives round about their measures has been to try and give them options to go for an election in the earlier part of next year. And if that flexibility comes at the expense of the long-term unemployed who are being threatened with getting their cases closed, for which read getting their benefits cut off if they're unable to find suitable employment after 18 months, then that's a price that Jeremy Hunt seems to be willing to take, because it's not a price that he or anyone that he knows personally is going to be on the receiving end of.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned fiscal drag there, which I'm struggling to understand and learn more about. Simon, I also heard some commentators say that Hunt had something like £27 million or possibly £1 billion to spare, which is why he thought he could afford tax cuts. But apparently he'd already spent that money when it came to departmental spending. I don't know if that's anything that you would be able to say anything about. Do you know anything about the mysteries of...
Well, no, that's true. And I mean, the capacity of the Tory government to re-announce things that they've already announced in the past, to spend money that they've already spent, and not to direct resources where it really needs. I mean, what we really need across Britain, and certainly in Scotland, which we'll come to, I think, in a minute, is a massive investment in a Green New Deal, in something that really can turn the economy around in the long run. But what we've had instead is 20 years of stagnation under Tory and Tory-led governments. As I mentioned a little earlier, according to the Resolution Foundation, drilling into the statistics from the Treasury, real wages are not going to return to 2008 levels until at least 2028. Under the current trajectory of policies. Real household disposable income is down 3.1% from December in 2019 through to January, it's projected 2025. When you look at who gets richer and poorer, £1,000 on average to the top wealthiest people in society from these latest policies, while the bottom 20% get only £200. And as Richard has already said, in terms of the impact on unemployed people, on disabled people, on long-term sick people, they are the people who are going to be punished and scapegoated. It is a scapegoating economic policy, as of course we also see with the immigration debate. So I think that Richard is probably right in his assessment of the political situation. The Tories will have looked at the recent polls. Jeremy Hunt did not produce any bounce in their favour as a result of these policies, and I think they will look for a giveaway in the spring statement. They don't really care about the state of the economy because I think they feel they're going to lose the next election. The thing is to dump Labour into the worst possible situation and seek to come back in 4 or 5 years' time. It's a very cynical kind of approach, and it's one which is widening the wealth gap in society, making social and economic living conditions for a very, very large number of people much worse. And of course, that is a breeding ground for the kind of far-right extremism we've also been talking about in this programme. So it's a serious issue socially and politically, as well as economically.
Thank you, Simon. Richard, so it seems that it's at a time when growth is at zero, and the OBR has downgraded growth for the next 3 years. And in fact, I thought it was interesting that Hunt was very quick to say that his autumn statement had been approved by the OBR, which I think I'm right in saying that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's catastrophic mini-budget had not been approved by the OBR, so Hunt was quick to get that in. But the OBR have said that growth is going to be down over the next 3 years, or it's put its figures down. It seems that Hunt found £20 billion for tax cuts by deciding not to protect public services. Would you say that's an accurate description?
I think so, yes. And as I said, if you look at the back of the documents that get produced, there was somewhere between 20 to 21 billion pounds that was part of his giveaway, if you like. But no, it's not going directly into public services. It's not going into public services at all, in fact. Part of it's the national insurance tax cut of 2p in the pound. The rest of it is some of the revenues foregone in terms of extending reliefs and things like that. How much does any of this turn around the anemic growth that we've seen? I very much doubt it. He's actually spending on research and development and trying to change that around. He's actually spending more on giving the equivalent of a full return of business rates to the Greater Manchester area and the West Midlands Combined Authority areas. He's spending more on that than he is on trying to boost research and development right across the UK. Now, Scotland, as you'd expect with its world-class university sector, does pretty well in R&D terms. It just about holds its own proportionately, but most R&D spend, which is the real driver of economic growth, takes place in London and the southeast of England. Wales, with about 4% of the population, struggles to hold on to about 2% of R&D, and even then, with that lion's share going into the southeast, overall R&D is still lagging well behind major competitor economies like Germany and France and many others that you could name, whether in the European Union or further afield. And of course, we've still got the effects of Brexit and driving with the handbrake on in terms of making it harder to export, making imports more expensive, all fueling inflation as well. So he may have come up in his 110 measures for small businesses with lots of small incremental things that make a small difference here and there. I'd be surprised if there weren't some things in there that are broadly beneficial. But in terms of making sure that our public services are fit for purpose, referencing back to a discussion we had about 10, 15 minutes ago, or in terms of making sure that he's really changing the dial on things like research and development, which is creating the opportunities and jobs of the future, or as Simon said, making sure that we're really starting to motor ahead in terms of the green transition. It's only a few weeks since the last auction round for offshore wind was held, and they got the grand total of no bids at all for offshore wind. So we're really in danger of losing out there as well in the energy transition, while we've got the cold dead hand of the UK government in charge of it. So there's all sorts of things that we're opportunities that were missed there, and a determination to get the politics of the moment right is missing the opportunities of the future. And but I think it would be a mistake politically to view the autumn statement in isolation. The real retail offer, if you like, is only a few months away in a spring statement. But I have to say that in terms of what he's trying to do to change the dial politically for the Conservative Party, is very, very unlikely to change the dial in terms of the economic opportunities that Westminster holds over the rest of us. And that in terms of the politics as well ought to tee up the SNP quite nicely in terms of arguing why those powers reserved to Westminster in terms of the economy should be transferred and exercised from an independent sovereign Scottish Parliament instead.
Thank you, Richard. So I'll move on to our next item, which is in the week when COP28 is about to start in the United Arab Emirates. We hear in Scotland that there's the Grangemouth, the oil refining plant in Grangemouth is set to close in 2025 with a loss of 400 jobs. Energy is devolved, of course, to Westminster. So this is an action that's been taken by the company that owns Grangemouth. It's not being closed down by the Westminster government, as some people on social media seem to think. The company said that the demand for the fuels that Grangemouth produces was expected to decline and the energy transition was well underway. And I guess we've always been told that as renewables increases, then fossil fuels would decrease and we would move away from fossil fuels and move towards renewables. The company said it would convert Grangemouth into a fuel import depot, which would see refined fossil fuels from abroad sent to the site for distribution throughout the UK. And this is where I hope that Simon and Richard, you can help, because I'm actually confused here. So Petro Ineos have decided that Grangemouth should become an import hub for foreign oil, and they're going to distribute that around the UK. But surely I heard the King Charles tell me that his government, Rishi Sunak's government, was going to open up new oil fields in the North Sea on an annual basis every year. And yet here's a Scottish refining oil refinery right next to the North Sea is being closed down because it's producing something that isn't going to be in so much demand with renewables. Simon, I'm going to come to you first. Can you help explain what's going on here? Why I'm confused?
Well, I was going to say let Richard go for this one first because he is the business and trade spokesperson for the
Can
S&P
do if you want.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, I think that looking at this at face value, there's refineries and there's refineries, and while the Forties pipeline comes ashore pretty near Grangemouth, much of the product that comes out of Grangemouth with the equipment and the processes that's there isn't actually what's meeting our energy demand, and there've been an awful lot of what was produced at Grangemouth can now be bought in cheaper from elsewhere. Certainly that's my kind of broad brush understanding of the situation. But and I think that given where we are in the energy transition, Jim Ratcliffe, the owner of Ineos, seems markedly disinclined to be investing in that facility. Now that raises questions about whether it was wise to allow him to take it over in the first place. But I do worry that while Grangemouth clearly has the capacity to be a point where hydrocarbons can be imported, and let's not forget hydrocarbons, for all the talk of an energy transition, are still meeting about 75% of our energy needs. I am worried about energy security if we're at the end of a pipeline rather than at the start of the pipeline of what has been produced. But I think Mr. Ratcliffe seems to be more interested in investing in his car plant venture and in Manchester United Football Club than he is on continuing and prolonging the life of Grangemouth as a petrochemicals site. And I think that's that just shows the dangers of allowing folk like him to be in charge of of such strategic assets. But the fundamental point is, if you are reducing the amount of hydrocarbons you're using, then you will over time have less demand for refineries, and you would expect the number of refineries to go down. I'm just not persuaded that that's the point we're at in the cycle. And as I say, as a matter of strategic importance, as a matter of our security, I would much rather see Grangemouth continuing to be able to provide the chemicals and hydrocarbons that an advanced economy for the moment still needs.
Thank you, Richard. And so, Simon, Grangemouth was saved from closure in 2013, and it seems it is a loss-making venture. It's called unsustainable losses of £361 million between 2020 and 2021. So we're wondering here in the studio if the Energy Secretary Neil Gray held a meeting on Friday afternoon, and he said that the Scottish Government was looking at ways the refinery could be kept in operation for longer. But could this maybe turn out to be a positive, if there really is a just transition and Grangemouth is transformed into a renewable energy hub?
Well, of course, that if is doing a lot of work there, and let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, what Richard said is absolutely correct. And I mean, of course, if you allow private interests to get hold of these strategic assets, not only do you potentially, in the longer run, have a problem of energy security, but you also have economic and financial decisions being distorted by those particular interests rather than an overall strategy. Now, I think this is incredibly important for Scotland, because if we're going to talk, as I believe we should, about political independence, we also have to think about economic independence. And having our resources in the hands of large private transnational interests is not in the long-term interests of Scotland, and we need to change that. Now, as far as Grangemouth is concerned, early days in the discussions at the moment. I know there's a lot of talk about carbon capture. Carbon capture has been used as a justification for new oil and gas projects. But the reality is it does have a history of poor performance. It only captures a fraction of the total emissions from the life cycle of oil and gas production. And its long-term efficacy is definitely questionable, as well as very expensive. And then also there's the question of, well, what about green hydrogen and so on? And the fundamental problem with that, some would say, lies in the laws of physics. Between 50 and 80% of the energy value of clean electricity is lost in the process of making hydrogen and then burning it to generate electricity. And some of those losses occur in the electrolysis process, which is roughly 70 to 80% efficient. So there are lots of technical challenges as well as political and economic challenges. But let's look at the broader picture, and particularly what should Scotland do? Well, Scotland's situation, and I need to be careful in saying this, is that we have a significant proportion of Scotland's on and offshore renewable energy potential. I'm not going to put a figure to that, because last time I attempted to do that, I used figures that have been used by the Scottish and UK governments, which I think have rightly been quite criticised. But this is very, very substantial. So we know where our future lies. The question, as I say, is who takes decisions about that and who owns it? And what is the strategy dealing with situations, loss-making situations like Grangemouth and so on, in the shorter run? Well, it seems to me that there are two things that really must happen. First of all, we need a joined up just transition policy linked to an industrial policy and linked to regional development, for example, in the northeast, which is absolutely critical for Scotland. And trade unions, the STUC and others, can play a really important role in that. Secondly, we do need a national energy company, asset-based, renewables-based. The Scottish Government has said it can't do that because of the limitations of devolution on the one hand, but the Welsh Government is managing to move ahead under not dissimilar circumstances, so I think there is more that we can do. And also that it can't be fully capitalised, which is true, but we can make a start. We need that instrument to be able to direct energy policy in the right direction. And then secondly, we need a credible roadmap for just transition. Now, here I should declare an interest, although I work for a non-party think tank and try to work most of the time across parties. I am, as it happens, the National Secretary of the SNP Trade Union Group, and I'm pleased that in 2021 we got a policy through conference. Well, recently, of course, we helped to get a policy through calling for public ownership of energy resources, which is necessary. But in 2021, we got a policy through which was actually calling for such a roadmap, and also a jobs register looking at where jobs were located, whether they were being justly transitioned or not, what remedial action needed to be taken to ensure that that happens, and so on. In other words, to have the data as well as the industrial and green energy plan that we need to make that possible. So I think there's more the Scottish Government can do in this context. But if we are in the long run reliant on decisions by the UK Government, we're in serious, serious trouble. And the necessity of a just transition and the necessity of addressing the climate catastrophe is one of the main drivers, it seems to me, towards a new offer around independence to the Scottish people.
Thank you, Simon. Richard, I'm just wondering, was there anything maybe in the autumn statement that would refer to this or be relevant to this? I'm thinking there was something about the national grid is going to be improved in some way. But was there anything in the autumn statement that you thought would maybe be relevant for this topic?
There's nothing I've seen in the autumn statement that's particularly relevant. Separately, the Energy Minister, Claire Coutinho at Westminster, announced plans to upgrade the grid. But while I don't think any sensible person would dispute the need to upgrade the grid, I'm less certain how they plan to unblock the planning issues that there appear to be around that, because from my time in local government, I can remember a number of planning applications that came in for whether for substations at the grid or in terms of the route that cabling might take. I think suggesting that people should get money off their electricity bills if they live close to proposed new power lines, I don't see that that's going to shift anything significantly. But the biggest change that we need to have in terms of our grid infrastructure is the one that we didn't hear, which is about the fact that generators in Scotland, where predominantly the greatest share of renewable energy is, are still going to be paying over the odds to connect to the grid. And that is what, as much as any blockages in capacity and zombie applications are in speculatively but going nowhere, it's that higher grid charging that is discriminating against where investment might go to the detriment of all. And, that's what we really need to see changing is the pricing structure that they put in there. Just accept we need the grid, just accept the infrastructure needs to go in and, make it easier for the areas with energy potential to connect to that without coming up with some arbitrary spreadsheet version of economics to discriminate against that, because that just, is taking rent out of the system and it's causing, and it holds us back.
Thank you, Richard. And maybe just staying with you, we've got a minute, I would say, maybe. So Simon was saying that the SNP government in Holyrood could do more, maybe possibly more like the Welsh Labour government. Is that something that you would agree with, or if you want to respond, or?
I'm not sure. I mean, basically, the biggest thing holding back the Scottish Government is the lack of long-term borrowing powers in order to capitalise that. And when you hear people say about something like Scotland that we're missing out on an opportunity, well, perhaps we are. But at the same time, in their calculations, you also have to factor in the cost of capital that's there. Now, if the Scottish Government had the freedom to capitalise projects like that, of course you would do it, and governments can generally capitalise these projects at a lower cost than the private sector. But I think by and large for now we are held back. And while you can still do things like through the Scottish Investment Bank, again, that's possibly at the expense of other areas where you're looking to put good capital, long-term capital investment for the future into place. So yeah, I'm sure you can always make an argument that more could be done. But for me, that's always tinkering around the margins until and unless you actually have the powers to do that. And that involves giving long-term borrowing powers to the Scottish Parliament, or preferably being in charge of all of that stuff yourself as an independent country, so you're not needing to look for permission from anyone else, anywhere else.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Well, that's the end of the show. Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Richard, again for giving up a sizable chunk of your valuable weekend time. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Okay, and to you, Richard, as well. So hopefully we'll see you both again sometime soon. let you go on with your weekends. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach the £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, your generosity has given us a little more time. We've raised over £21,000 and we've been able to continue making programmes for now. But we need to raise the remaining £9,000 as soon as possible. But again, thank you to our guests, to Richard and to Simon. Goodbye and thank you for watching.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.